Do you really think the world around you is perfectly safe? Perhaps the person right next to you is hiding a dark truth. New Moon on our channel, we uncover bone-chilling crimes and psychological thrillers that you've never heard before. To dive into the depths of mystery, subscribe now, and if you enjoy the video, stay with us by leaving a like. Remember, the truth isn't always right in front of your eyes.
South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 12, Elephant Island, Part 1. The 22 men who had been left behind on Elephant Island were under the command of Wild, in whom I had absolute confidence, and the account of their experiences during the long 4.5 months' wait while I was trying to get help to them, I have secured from their various diaries, supplemented by details which I obtained in conversation on the voyage back to civilization. The first consideration, which was even more important than that of food, was to provide shelter. The semi-starvation during the drift on the ice floe, added to the exposure in the boats, and the inclemencies of the weather encountered after our landing on Elephant Island, had left its mark on a good many of them. Rickenson, who bore up gamely to the last, collapsed from heart failure. Blackborough and Hudson could not move. All were frostbitten in varying degrees, and their clothes, which had been worn continuously for 6 months, were much the worse for wear. The blizzard which sprang up the day that we landed at Cape Wild lasted for a fortnight, often blowing at the rate of 70 to 90 miles an hour, and occasionally reaching even higher figures. The tents which had lasted so well, and endured so much, were torn to ribbons, with the exception of the square tent occupied by Hurley, James, and Hudson. Sleeping bags and clothes were wringing wet, and the physical discomforts were tending to produce acute mental depression. The 2 remaining boats had been turned upside down, with one gunwale resting on the snow, and the other raised about 2 feet on rocks and cases, and under these the sailors and some of the scientists, with the 2 invalids, Rickenson and Blackborough, found head cover at least. Shelter from the weather, and warmth to dry their clothes, was imperative, so Wild hastened the excavation of the ice cave in the slope which had been started before I left. The high temperature, however, caused a continuous stream of water to drip from the roof and sides of the ice cave, and as with 22 men living in it, the temperature would be practically always above freezing, there would have been no hope of dry quarters for them there. Under the direction of Wild, they therefore collected some big flat stones, having in many cases to dig down under the snow which was covering the beach, and with these they erected 2 substantial walls, 4 feet high and 19 feet apart. We are all ridiculously weak, and this part of the work was exceedingly laborious, and took us more than twice as long as it would have done had we been in normal health. Stones that we could easily have lifted at other times we found quite beyond our capacity, and it needed 2 or 3 of us to carry some that would otherwise have been one man's load. Our difficulties were added to by the fact that most of the more suitable stones lay at the farther end of the spit, some 150 yards away. Our weakness is best compared with that which one experiences on getting up from a long illness. One feels well, but physically enervated. The site chosen for the hut was the spot where the stove had been originally erected on the night of our arrival. It lay between 2 large boulders, which, if they would not actually form the walls of the hut, would at least provide a valuable protection from the wind. Further protection was provided to the north by a hill called Penguin Hill, at the end of the spit. As soon as the walls were completed and squared off, the 2 boats were laid upside down on them, side by side. The exact adjustment of the boats took some time, but was of paramount importance if our structure was to be the permanent affair that we hoped it would be. Once in place, they were securely chocked up and lashed down to the rocks. The few pieces of wood that we had were laid across from keel to keel, and over this the material of one of the torn tents was spread and secured with guys to the rocks. The walls were ingeniously contrived and fixed up by Marsden. First he cut the now useless tents into suitable lengths. Then he cut the legs of a pair of sea boots into narrow strips, and using these in much the same way that the leather binding is put round the edge of upholstered chairs, he nailed the tent cloth all round the insides of the outer gunwales of the 2 boats, in such a way that it hung down like a valance to the ground, where it was secured with spars and oars. A couple of overlapping blankets made the door, superseded later by a sack-mouth door cut from one of the tents. This consisted of a sort of tube of canvas sewn onto the tent cloth, through which the men crawled in or out, tying it up as one would the mouth of a sack as soon as the man had passed through. It is certainly the most convenient and efficient door for these conditions that has ever been invented. Whilst the side walls of the hut were being fixed, others proceeded to fill the interstices between the stones of the end walls with snow. As this was very powdery and would not bind well, we eventually had to supplement it with the only spare blanket and an overcoat. All this work was very hard on our frostbitten fingers, and materials were very limited. At last all was completed, and we were invited to bring in our sodden bags, which had been lying out in the drizzling rain for several hours, for the tents and boats that had previously sheltered them had all been requisitioned to form our new residence. We took our places under Wild's direction. There was no squabbling for best places, but it was noticeable that there was something in the nature of a rush for the billets up on the thwarts of the boats. Rickenson, who was still very weak and ill, but very cheery, obtained a place in the boat directly above the stove, and the sailors having lived under the Stancombe Wills for a few days, while she was upside down on the beach, tacitly claimed it as their own, and flocked up onto its thwarts as one man. There was one upstairs billet left in this boat, which Wild offered to Hussey and Lees simultaneously, saying that the first man that got his bag up could have the billet. Whilst Lees was calculating the pros and cons, Hussey got his bag and had it up just as Lees had determined that the pros had it. There were now 4 men up on the thwarts of the Dudley Docker, and the 5 sailors and Hussey on those of the Stancombe Wills, the remainder disposing themselves on the floor. The floor was at first covered with snow and ice, frozen in amongst the pebbles. This was cleared out, and the remainder of the tents spread out over the stones. Within the shelter of these cramped but comparatively palatial quarters, cheerfulness once more reigned amongst the party. The blizzard, however, soon discovered the flaws in the architecture of their hut, and the fine drift snow forced its way through the crevices between the stones forming the end walls. Jaeger sleeping bags and coats were spread over the outside of these walls, packed over with snow and securely frozen up, effectively keeping out this drift. At first, all the cooking was done outside, under the lee of some rocks, further protection being provided by a wall of provision cases. There were 2 blubber stoves made from old oil drums, and, one day, when the blizzard was unusually severe, an attempt was made to cook the meals inside the hut. There being no means of escape for the pungent blubber smoke, the inmates had a rather bad time, some being affected with a form of smoke blindness, similar to snow blindness, very painful and requiring medical attention. A chimney was soon fitted, made by Kerr out of the tin lining of one of the biscuit cases, and passed through a close-fitting tin grommet, sewn into the canvas of the roof, just between the keels of the 2 boats, and the smoke nuisance was soon a thing of the past. Later on, another old oil drum was made to surround this chimney, so that 2 pots could be cooked at once on the one stove. Those whose billets were near the stove suffered from the effects of the local thaw caused by its heat, but they were repaid by being able to warm up portions of steak and hooshes left over from previous meals, and even to warm up those of the less fortunate ones, for a consideration. This consisted generally of part of the hoosh, or 1 or 2 pieces of sugar. The cook and his assistant, which latter job was taken by each man in turn, were called about 7 a.m, and breakfast was generally ready by about 10 a.m. Provision cases were then arranged in a wide circle round the stove, and those who were fortunate enough to be next to it could dry their gear. So that all should benefit equally by this, a sort of general post was carried out, each man occupying his place at mealtimes for one day only, moving up one the succeeding day. In this way, eventually, every man managed to dry his clothes, and life began to assume a much brighter aspect. The great trouble in the hut was the absence of light. The canvas walls were covered with blubber soot, and with the snowdrifts accumulating round the hut, its inhabitants were living in a state of perpetual night. Lamps were fashioned out of sardine tins, with bits of surgical bandage for wicks. But as the oil consisted of seal oil rendered down from the blubber, the remaining fibrous tissue being issued very sparingly at lunch, by the by, and being considered a great delicacy, they were more a means of conserving the scanty store of matches than of serving as illuminants. Wild was the first to overcome this difficulty by sewing into the canvas wall the glass lid of a chronometer box. Later on 3 other windows were added, the material in this case being some celluloid panels from a photograph case of mine which I had left behind in a bag. This enabled the occupants of the floor billets, who were near enough, to read and sew, which relieved the monotony of the situation considerably. Our reading material consisted at this time of 2 books of poetry, 1 book of Nordenskjöld's Expedition, 1 or 2 torn volumes of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and a penny cookery book owned by Marston. Our clothes, though never presentable, as they bore the scars of nearly 10 months of rough usage, had to be continually patched to keep them together at all. As the floor of the hut had been raised by the addition of loads of clean pebbles, from which most of the snow had been removed, during the cold weather it was kept comparatively dry. When, however, the temperature rose to just above freezing point, as occasionally happened, the hut became the drainage pool of all the surrounding hills. Wild was the first to notice it by remarking one morning that his sleeping bag was practically afloat. Other men examined theirs with a like result, so bailing operations commenced forthwith. Stones were removed from the floor and a large hole dug, and in its gloomy depths the water could be seen rapidly rising. Using a saucepan for a bailer, they bailed out over 100 gallons of dirty water. The next day 150 gallons were removed, the men taking it in turns to bail at intervals during the night. 160 more gallons were bailed out during the next 24 hours, till one man rather pathetically remarked in his diary, "This is what nice, mild, high temperatures mean to us. No wonder we prefer the cold." Eventually, by removing a portion of one wall, a long channel was dug nearly down to the sea, completely solving the problem. Additional precautions were taken by digging away the snow which surrounded the hut after each blizzard, sometimes entirely obscuring it. A huge glacier across the bay behind the hut nearly put an end to the party. Enormous blocks of ice, weighing many tons, would break off and fall into the sea, the disturbance thus caused giving rise to great waves. One day, Marston was outside the hut digging up the frozen seal for lunch with a pick, when a noise like an artillery barrage startled him. Looking up, he saw that one of these tremendous waves, over 30 feet high, was advancing rapidly across the bay, threatening to sweep hut and inhabitants into the sea. A hastily shouted warning brought the men tumbling out, but fortunately the loose ice which filled the bay damped the wave down so much that, though it flowed right under the hut, nothing was carried away. It was a narrow escape, though, as, had they been washed into the sea, nothing could have saved them. Although they themselves gradually became accustomed to the darkness and the dirt, some entries in their diaries show that occasionally they could realize the conditions under which they were living. The hut grows more grimy every day. Everything is a sooty black. We have arrived at the limit, where further increments from the smoking stove, blubber lamps, and cooking gear are unnoticed. It is at least comforting to feel that we can become no filthier. Our shingle floor will scarcely bear examination by strong light, without causing even us to shudder and express our disapprobation at its state. Oil, mixed with reindeer hair, bits of meat, sennegrass, and penguin feathers, form a conglomeration which cements the stones together. From time to time we have a spring cleaning, but a fresh supply of flooring material is not always available, as all the shingle is frozen up and buried by deep rifts. Such is our home sweet home. All joints are aching through being compelled to lie on the hard, rubbly floor which forms our bedsteads. Again, later on, one writes, "Now that Wilde's window allows a shaft of light to enter our hut, one can begin to see things inside. Previously, one relied on one's sense of touch, assisted by the remarks from those whose faces were inadvertently trodden on, to guide one to the door. Looking down in the semi-darkness to the far end, one observes two very small, smoky flares that dimly illuminate a row of 5, endeavouring to make time pass by reading or argument. These are Macklin, Kerr, Wordy, Hudson, and Blackborough, the last 2 being invalids. The centre of the hut is filled with the cases which do duty for the cook's bed, the meat and the blubber boxes, and a mummified-looking object, which is Lee's in his sleeping bag. The near end of the floor space is taken up with the stove, with Wilde and McIlroy on one side, and Hurley and James on the other. Marston occupies a hammock most of the night and day, which is slung across the entrance. As he is large, and the entrance very small, he invariably gets bumped by those passing in and out. His vocabulary at such times is interesting. In the attic, formed by the 2 upturned boats, live 10 unkempt and careless lodgers, who drop boots, mitts, and other articles of apparel onto the men below. Reindeer hairs rain down incessantly day and night, with every movement that they make in their molting bags. These, with penguin feathers and a little grit from the floor, occasionally savour the hooshes. Thank heaven man is an adaptable brute. If we dwell sufficiently long in this hut, we are likely to alter our method of walking, for our ceiling, which is but 4 foot 6 inches high at its highest part, compels us to walk bent double or on all fours. Our doorway, Cheetham is just crawling in now, bringing a shower of snow with him, was originally a tent entrance. When one wishes to go out, one unties the cord securing the door, and crawls or wriggles out, at the same time exclaiming, "Thank goodness I'm in the open air." This should suffice to describe the atmosphere inside the hut, only pleasant when charged with the overpowering yet appetizing smell of burning penguin steaks. From all parts there dangles an odd collection of blubbery garments, hung up to dry, through which one crawls, much as a chicken in an incubator. Our walls of tent canvas admit as much light as might be expected from a closed Venetian blind. It is astonishing how we have grown accustomed to inconveniences, and tolerate, at least, habits which a little time back were regarded with repugnance. We have no forks, but each man has a sheath knife and a spoon, the latter in many cases having been fashioned from a piece of box lid. The knife serves many purposes. With it we kill, skin, and cut up seals and penguins, cut blubber into strips for the fire, very carefully scrape the snow off our hut walls, and then, after a perfunctory rub with an oily penguin skin, use it at meals. We are as regardless of our grime and dirt as is the Eskimo. We have been unable to wash since we left the ship nearly 10 months ago. For one thing, we have no soap or towels, only bare necessities being brought with us. And again, had we possessed these articles, our supply of fuel would only permit us to melt enough ice for drinking purposes. Had one man washed, half a dozen others would have had to go without a drink all day. One cannot suck ice to relieve the thirst, as at these low temperatures it cracks the lips and blisters the tongue. Still, we are all very cheerful. During the whole of their stay on Elephant Island, the weather was described by Wilde as simply appalling. Stranded as they were on a narrow sandy beach, surrounded by high mountains, they saw little of the scanty sunshine during the brief intervals of clear sky. On most days, the air was full of snowdrift blown from the adjacent heights. Elephant Island being practically on the outside edge of the pack, the winds which passed over the relatively warm ocean before reaching it clothed it in a constant pall of fog and snow. On April 25th, the day after I left for South Georgia, the island was beset by heavy pack ice, with snow and a wet mist. Next day was calmer, but on the 27th, to quote one of the diaries, they experienced the most wretched weather conceivable, raining all night and day and blowing hard, wet to the skin. The following day brought heavy fog and sleet and a continuance of the blizzard. April ended with a terrific windstorm which nearly destroyed the hut. The one remaining tent had to be dismantled, the pole taken down, and the inhabitants had to lie flat all night under the icy canvas. This lasted well into May, and a typical May day is described as follows. A day of terrific winds, threatening to dislodge our shelter. The wind is a succession of hurricane gusts that sweep down the glacier immediately south-southwest of us. Each gust heralds its approach by a low rumbling which increases to a thunderous roar. Snow, stones and gravel are flying about, and any gear left unweighted by very heavy stones is carried away to sea. Heavy bales of sennegrass and boxes of cooking gear were lifted bodily into the air and carried away out of sight. Once the wind carried off the floorcloth of a tent which 6 men were holding onto and shaking the snow off. These gusts often came with alarming suddenness and without any warning. Hussey was outside in the blizzard digging up the day's meat which had frozen to the ground, when a gust caught him and drove him down the spit toward the sea. Fortunately, when he reached the softer sand and shingle below high water mark, he managed to stick his pick into the ground and hold on with both hands till the squall had passed. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. By Corey Samuel. South. The Story of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 12. Elephant Island, Part 2. On 1 or 2 rare occasions they had fine, calm, clear days. The glow of the dying sun on the mountains and glaciers filled even the most materialistic of them with wonder and admiration. These days were sometimes succeeded by calm, clear nights, when, but for the cold, they would have stayed out on the sandy beach all night. About the middle of May a terrific blizzard sprang up, blowing from 60 to 90 miles an hour, and Wilde entertained grave fears for their hut. One curious feature noted in this blizzard was the fact that the huge ice sheets, as big as window panes and about 1/4 of an inch thick, were being hurled about by the wind, making it as dangerous to walk about outside as if one were in an avalanche of splintered glass. Still, these winds from the south and southwest, though invariably accompanied by snow and low temperatures, were welcome in that they drove the pack ice away from the immediate vicinity of the island, and so gave rise on each occasion to hopes of relief. Northeast winds, on the other hand, by filling the bays with ice and bringing thick, misty weather, made it impossible to hope for any ship to approach them. Towards the end of May a period of dead calm set in, with ice closely packed all round the island. This gave place to northeast winds and mist, and at the beginning of June came another southwest blizzard, with cold driving snow. The blizzard increased to terrific gusts during the night, causing us much anxiety for the safety of our hut. There was little sleep, all being apprehensive of the canvas roof ripping off and the boats being blown out to sea. Thus it continued, alternating between southwest blizzards, when they were all confined to the hut, and northeast winds, bringing cold, damp, misty weather. On June 25th, a severe storm from northwest was recorded, accompanied by strong winds and heavy seas, which encroached upon their little sandy beach up to within 4 yards of their hut. Towards the end of July and the beginning of August, they had a few fine, calm, clear days. Occasional glimpses of the sun, with high temperatures, were experienced, after southwest winds had blown all the ice away, and their party, their spirits cheered by Wilde's unfailing optimism, again began to look eagerly for the rescue ship. The first 3 attempts at their rescue unfortunately coincided with the times when the island was beset with ice, and though on the second occasion we approached close enough to fire a gun, in the hope that they would hear the sound and know that we were safe and well, yet so accustomed were they to the noise made by the carving of the adjacent glacier that either they did not hear or the sound passed unnoticed. On August 16th, pack was observed on the horizon, and the next day the bay was filled with loose ice, which soon consolidated. Soon afterwards, huge old floes and many bergs drifted in. The pack appears as dense as we have ever seen it. No open water is visible, and ice blink girdles the horizon. The weather is wretched, a stagnant calm of air and ocean alike, the latter obscured by dense pack through which no swell can penetrate, and a wet mist hangs like a pall over land and sea. The silence is oppressive. There is nothing to do but stay in one's sleeping bag, or else wander in the soft snow and become thoroughly wet. 15 inches of snow fell in the next 24 hours, making over 2 feet between August 18th and 21st. A slight swell next day from the northeast ground up the pack ice, but this soon subsided and the pack became consolidated once more. On August 27th, a strong west-southwest wind sprang up and drove all this ice out of the bay, and except for some stranded bergs, left a clear, ice-free sea, through which we finally made our way from Punta Arenas to Elephant Island. As soon as I had left the island to get help for the rest of the expedition, Wild set all hands to collect as many seals and penguins as possible, in case their stay was longer than was at first anticipated. A sudden rise in temperature caused a whole lot to go bad and become unfit for food, so while a fair reserve was kept in hand, too much was not accumulated. At first the meals, consisting mostly of seal meat, with 1 hot drink per day, were cooked on a stove in the open. The snow and wind, besides making it very unpleasant for the cook, filled all the cooking pots with sand and grit, so during the winter the cooking was done inside the hut. A little Cerebus salt had been saved, and this was issued out at the rate of 3/4 of an ounce per man per week. Some of the packets containing the salt had broken, so that all did not get the full ration. On the other hand, one man dropped his week's ration on the floor of the hut, amongst the stones and dirt. It was quickly collected, and he found to his delight that he had enough now to last him for 3 weeks. Of course, it was not all salt. The hot drink consisted at first of milk made from milk powder, up to about 1/4 of its proper strength. This was later on diluted still more, and sometimes replaced by a drink made from a pea soup-like packing from the Bovril sledging rations. For Midwinter's Day celebrations, a mixture of 1 teaspoonful of methylated spirit in a pint of hot water, flavoured with a little ginger and sugar, served to remind some of cocktails and Veuve Clicquot. At breakfast, each had a piece of seal or half a penguin breast. Luncheon consisted of 1 biscuit on 3 days a week, nut food on Thursdays, bits of blubber from which most of the oil had been extracted for the lamps on 2 days a week, and nothing on the remaining day. On this day, breakfast consisted of a half-strength sledging ration. Supper was almost invariably seal and penguin, cut up very finely and fried with a little seal blubber. There were occasionally very welcome variations from this menu. Some paddies, a little white bird not unlike a pigeon, were snared with a loop of string and fried with 1 water-sodden biscuit for lunch. Enough barley and peas for 1 meal all round of each had been saved, and when this was issued it was a day of great celebration. Sometimes, by general consent, the luncheon biscuit would be saved, and, with the next serving of biscuit, was crushed in a canvas bag into a powder and boiled, with a little sugar, making a very satisfying pudding. When blubber was fairly plentiful, there was always a saucepan of cold water, made from melting down the pieces of ice which had broken off from the glacier, fallen into the sea, and been washed ashore, for them to quench their thirst in. As the experience of Arctic explorers tended to show that seawater produced a form of dysentery, Wild was rather diffident about using it. Penguin carcasses boiled in one part of seawater to 4 of fresh were a great success though, and no ill effects were felt by anybody. The ringed penguins migrated north the day after we landed at Cape Wild, and though every effort was made to secure as large a stock of meat and blubber as possible, by the end of the month the supply was so low that only 1 hot meal a day could be served. Twice the usual number of penguin steaks were cooked at breakfast, and the ones intended for supper were kept hot in the pots by wrapping up in coats, etc. Clark put our saucepanful in his sleeping bag today to keep it hot, and it really was a great success, in spite of the extra helping of reindeer hairs that it contained. In this way we can make 10 penguin skins do for 1 day. Some who were fortunate enough to catch penguins with fairly large undigested fish in their gullets used to warm these up in tins hung on bits of fire round the stove. All the meat intended for hooshes is cut up inside the hut, as it is too cold outside. As the boards which we use for the purpose are also used for cutting up tobacco, when we still have it, a definite flavour is sometimes imparted to the hoosh, which, if anything, improves it. Their diet was now practically all meat, and not too much of that, and all the diaries bear witness to their craving for carbohydrates, such as flour, oatmeal, etc. One man longingly speaks of the cabbages which grow on Kerguelen Island. By June 18th there were only 900 lumps of sugar left, i.e. just over 40 pieces each. Even my readers know what shortage of sugar means at this very date, but from a different cause. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that all their thoughts and conversation should turn to food, past and future banquets, and second helpings that had been once refused. A census was taken, each man being asked to state just what he would like to eat at that moment if he were allowed to have anything that he wanted. All, with but one exception, desired a suet pudding of some sort, the duff beloved of sailors. Macklin asked for many returns of scrambled eggs on hot buttered toast. Several voted for a prodigious Devonshire dumpling, while Wilde wished for any old dumpling so long as it was a large one. The craving for carbohydrates, such as flour and sugar, and for fats, was very real. Marsden had with him a small penny cookery book. From this he would read out one recipe each night, so as to make them last. This would be discussed very seriously, and alterations and improvements suggested, and then they would turn into their bags to dream of wonderful meals that they could never reach. The following conversation was recorded in one diary. Wilde: do you like doughnuts? McIlroy: rather. Wilde: very easily made too. I like them cold with a little jam. McIlroy: not bad, but how about a huge omelette? Wilde: fine, with a deep sigh. Overhead, 2 of the sailors are discussing some extraordinary mixture of hash, apple sauce, beer and cheese. Marsden is in his hammock, reading from his penny cookery book. Farther down, someone eulogizes Scotch shortbread. Several of the sailors are talking of spotted dog, sea pie and Lockhart's with great feeling. Someone mentions nut food, whereat the conversation becomes general, and we all decide to buy £1 worth of it as soon as we get to civilization, and retire to a country house to eat it undisturbed. At present we really mean it too. Midwinter's Day, the great polar festival, was duly observed. A magnificent breakfast of sledging ration hooch, full strength and well boiled to thicken it, with hot milk was served. Luncheon consisted of a wonderful pudding invented by Wilde, made of powdered biscuit boiled with 12 pieces of mouldy nut food. Supper was a very finely cut seal hoosh, flavoured with sugar. After supper they had a concert, accompanied by Hussey on his indispensable banjo. This banjo was the last thing to be saved off the ship before she sank, and I took it with us as a mental tonic. It was carried all the way through with us, and landed on Elephant Island practically unharmed, and did much to keep the men cheerful. Nearly every Saturday night such a concert was held, when each one sang a song about some other member of the party. If that one objected to some of the comments, a worse one was written for the next week. The cook, who had carried on so well and for so long, was given a rest on August 9th, and each man took it in turns to be cook for 1 week. As the cook and his mate had the privilege of scraping out the saucepans, there was some anxiety to secure the job, especially amongst those with the larger appetites. The last of the methylated spirit was drunk on August 12th, and from then onwards the King's Health, Sweethearts and Wives, and the Boss and Crew of the Caird were drunk in hot water and ginger every Saturday night. The penguins and seals, which had migrated north at the beginning of winter, had not yet returned, or else the icefoot, which surrounded the spit to a thickness of 6 feet, prevented them from coming ashore, so that food was getting short. Old seal bones, that had been used once for a meal and then thrown away, were dug up and stewed down with sea water. Penguin carcasses were treated likewise. Limpets were gathered from the pools disclosed between the rocks below high tide, after the pack ice had been driven away. It was a cold job gathering these little shellfish, as for each one, the whole hand and arm had to be plunged into the icy water, and many score of these small creatures had to be collected to make anything of a meal. Seaweed boiled in seawater was used to eke out the rapidly diminishing stock of seal and penguin meat. This did not agree with some of the party. Though it was acknowledged to be very tasty, it only served to increase their appetite, a serious thing when there was nothing to satisfy it with. One man remarked in his diary, "We had a sumptuous meal today, nearly 5 ounces of solid food each." It is largely due to Wilde, and to his energy, initiative and resource, that the whole party kept cheerful all along, and indeed came out alive and so well. Assisted by the 2 surgeons, Doctors McIlroy and Macklin, he had ever a watchful eye for the health of each one. His cheery optimism never failed, even when food was very short and the prospect of relief seemed remote. Each one in his diary speaks with admiration of him. I think, without doubt, that all the party who were stranded on Elephant Island owe their lives to him. The demons of depression could find no foothold when he was around, and not content with merely telling, he was doing as much as, and very often more than, the rest. He showed wonderful capabilities of leadership, and more than justified the absolute confidence that I placed in him. Hussey, with his cheeriness and his banjo, was another vital factor in chasing away any tendency to downheartedness. Once they were settled in their hut, the health of the party was quite good. Of course they were all a bit weak, some were light-headed, all were frostbitten, and others, later, had attacks of heart failure. Blackborrow, whose toes were so badly frostbitten in the boats, had to have all 5 amputated while on the island. With insufficient instruments and no proper means of sterilizing them, the operation, carried out as it was in a dark, grimy hut with only a blubber stove to keep up the temperature, and with an outside temperature well below freezing, speaks volumes for the skill and initiative of the surgeons. I am glad to be able to say that the operation was very successful, and after a little treatment ashore, very kindly given by the Chilean doctors at Punta Arenas, he has now completely recovered and walks with only a slight limp. Hudson, who developed bronchitis and hip disease, was practically well again when the party was rescued. All trace of the severe frostbite suffered in the boat journey had disappeared, though traces of recent superficial ones remained on some. All were naturally weak when rescued, owing to having been on such scanty rations for so long, but all were alive and very cheerful, thanks to Frank Wilde. August 30th, 1916, is described in their diaries as a day of wonders. Food was very short, only 2 days' seal and penguin meat being left, and no prospect of any more arriving. The whole party had been collecting limpets and seaweed to eat with the stewed seal bones. Lunch was being served by Wilde, Hurley and Marston waiting outside to take a last long look at the direction from which they expected the ship to arrive. From a fortnight after I had left, Wilde would roll up his sleeping bag each day with the remark, "Get your things ready, boys, the boss may come today." And sure enough, one day the mist opened and revealed the ship for which they had been waiting and longing and hoping for over 4 months. Marsden was the first to notice it, and immediately yelled out, "Ship-o!" The inmates of the hut mistook it for a call of "Lunch-o!" so took no notice at first. Soon, however, we heard him pattering along the snow as fast as he could run, and in a gasping, anxious voice, hoarse with excitement, he shouted, "Wild! There's a ship! Hadn't we better light a flare?" We all made one dive for our narrow door. Those who could not get through tore down the canvas walls in their hurry and excitement. The hoosh pot, with our precious limpets and seaweed, was kicked over in the rush. There, just rounding the island which had previously hidden her from our sight, we saw a little ship flying the Chilean flag. We tried to cheer, but excitement had gripped our vocal cords. Macklin had made a rush for the flagstaff, previously placed in the most conspicuous position on the ice slope. The running gear would not work, and the flag was frozen into a solid, compact mass, so he tied his jersey to the top of the pole for a signal. Wild put a pick through our last remaining tin of petrol, and soaking coats, mitts and socks with it, carried them to the top of Penguin Hill at the end of our spit, and soon they were ablaze. Meanwhile most of us had gathered on the foreshore, watching with anxious eyes for any signs that the ship had seen us, or for any answering signals. As we stood and gazed, she seemed to turn away as if she had not seen us. Again and again we cheered, though our feeble cries could certainly not have carried so far. Suddenly she stopped, a boat was lowered, and we could recognise Sir Ernest's figure as he climbed down the ladder. Simultaneously we burst into a cheer, and then one said to the other, "Thank God, the boss is safe." For I think that his safety was of more concern to us than was our own. Soon the boat approached near enough for the boss, who was standing up in the bows, to shout to Wild, "Are you all well?" To which he replied, "All safe, all well," and we could see a smile light up the boss's face as he said, "Thank God." Before he could land, he threw ashore a handsful of cigarettes and tobacco, and these the smokers, who for 2 months had been trying to find solace in such substitutes as seaweed, finely chopped pipe bowls, seal meat and sennegrass, grasped greedily. Blackborough, who could not walk, had been carried to a high rock and propped up in his sleeping bag so that he could view the wonderful scene. Soon we were tumbling into the boat, and the Chilean sailors laughing up at us seemed as pleased at our rescue as we were. Twice more the boat returned, and within an hour of our first having sighted the boat, we were heading northwards to the outer world from which we had had no news since October 1914, over 22 months before. We are like men awakened from a long sleep. We are trying to acquire suddenly the perspective which the rest of the world has acquired gradually through 2 years of war. There are many events which have happened of which we shall never know. Our first meal, owing to our weakness and the atrophied state of our stomachs, proved disastrous to a good many. They soon recovered though. Our beds were just shakedowns on cushions and settees, though the officer on watch very generously gave up his bunk to 2 of us. I think we got very little sleep that night. It was just heavenly to lie and listen to the throb of the engines, instead of to the crack of the breaking floe, the beat of the surf on the ice-strewn shore, or the howling of the blizzard. We intend to keep August 30th as a festival for the rest of our lives. You readers can imagine my feelings as I stood in the little cabin, watching my rescued comrades feeding. End of Chapter 12, Part 2.
South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 13, Part 1. The Ross Sea Party. I now turn to the fortunes and misfortunes of the Ross Sea Party and the Aurora. In spite of extraordinary difficulties occasioned by the breaking out of the Aurora from her winter quarters before sufficient stores and equipment had been landed, Captain Aeneas Mackintosh and the party under his command achieved the object of this side of the expedition. For the depot that was the main object of the expedition was laid in the spot that I had indicated, and if the transcontinental party had been fortunate enough to have crossed, they would have found the assistance, in the shape of stores, that would have been vital to the success of their undertaking. Owing to the dearth of stores, clothing, and sledging equipment, the depot party was forced to travel more slowly and with greater difficulty than would have otherwise been the case. The result was that in making this journey the greatest qualities of endurance, self-sacrifice, and patience were called for, and the call was not in vain, as you, reading the following pages, will realize. It is more than regrettable that after having gone through those many months of hardship and toil, Mackintosh and Hayward should have been lost. Spencer Smith, during those long days, dragged by his comrades on the sledge, suffering but never complaining, became an example to all men. Mackintosh and Hayward owed their lives on that journey to the unremitting care and strenuous endeavours of Joyce, Wild, and Richards, who, also scurvy-stricken, but fitter than their comrades, dragged them through the deep snow and blizzards on the sledges. I think that no more remarkable story of human endeavour has been revealed than the tale of that long march which I have collated from various diaries. Unfortunately, the diary of the leader of this side of the expedition was lost with him. The outstanding feature of the Ross Sea side was the journey made by these 6 men. The earlier journeys for the first year did not produce any signs of the qualities of leadership amongst the others. Mackintosh was fortunate for the long journey in that he had these 3 men with him, Ernest Wild, Richards, and Joyce. Before proceeding with the adventures of this party, I want to make clear in these pages how much I appreciate the assistance I received both in Australia and New Zealand, especially in the latter dominion. And amongst the many friends there, it is not invidious on my part to lay special stress on the name of Leonard Tripp, who has been my mentor, counsellor, and friend for many years, and who, when the expedition was in precarious and difficult circumstances, devoted his energy, thought, and gave his whole time and advice to the best interests of our cause. I also must thank Edward Saunders, who for the second time has greatly helped me in preparing an expedition record for publication. To the Dominion Government I tender my warmest thanks. To the people of New Zealand, and especially to those many friends, too numerous to mention here, who helped us when our fortunes were at a low ebb, I wish to say that their kindness is an evergreen memory to me. If ever a man had cause to be grateful for assistance in dark days, I am he. The Aurora, under the command of Captain Aeneas Mackintosh, sailed from Hobart for the Ross Sea on December 24th, 1914. The ship had refitted in Sydney, where the state and federal governments had given generous assistance, and would be able, if necessary, to spend 2 years in the Antarctic. My instructions to Captain Mackintosh, in brief, were to proceed to the Ross Sea, make a base at some convenient point in or near McMurdo Sound, land stores and equipment, and lay depots on the great ice barrier in the direction of the Beardmore Glacier for the use of the party that I expected to bring overland from the Weddell Sea coast. This programme would involve some heavy sledging, but the ground to be covered was familiar, and I had not anticipated that the work would present any great difficulties. The Aurora carried materials for a hut, equipment for landing and sledging parties, stores and clothing of all the kinds required, and an ample supply of sledges. There were also dog teams and one of the motor tractors. I had told Captain Mackintosh that it was possible the transcontinental journey would be attempted in the 1914-15 season in the event of the landing on the Weddell Sea coast proving unexpectedly easy, and it would be his duty, therefore, to lay out depots to the south immediately after his arrival at the base. I had directed him to place a depot of food and fuel oil at latitude 80 degrees south in 1914-15, with cairns and flags as guides to a sledging party approaching from the direction of the pole. He would place depots farther south in the 1915-16 season. The Aurora had an uneventful voyage southwards. She anchored off the sealing huts at Macquarie Island on Christmas Day, December 25th. The wireless station erected by Sir Douglas Mawson's Australian Antarctic expedition could be seen on a hill to the northwest, with the expedition's hut at the base of the hill. This hut was still occupied by a meteorological staff, and later in the day the meteorologist, Mr. Tulloch, came off to the ship and had dinner aboard. The Aurora had some stores for the Macquarie Island party, and these were sent ashore during succeeding days in the boats. The landing place was a rough, kelp-guarded beach, where lay the remains of the New Zealand barque Clyde. Macquarie Island anchorages are treacherous, and several ships engaged in the sealing and whaling trade have left their bones on the rocky shores, where bask great herds of seals and sea elephants. The Aurora sailed from the island on December 31st, and 3 days later they sighted the first iceberg, a tabular berg rising 250 feet above the sea. This was in latitude 62 degrees 44 minutes south, longitude 169 degrees 58 minutes east. The next day, in latitude 64 degrees 27 minutes 38 seconds south, the Aurora passed through the first belt of pack ice. At 9 a.m. on January 7th, Mount Sabine, a mighty peak of the Admiralty Range, South Victoria Land, was sighted 75 miles distant. It had been proposed that a party of 3 men should travel to Cape Crozier from winter quarters during the winter months in order to secure emperor penguins' eggs. The ship was to call at Cape Crozier, land provisions and erect a small hut of fibro-concrete sheets for the use of this party. The ship was off the Cape on the afternoon of January 9th, and the boat put off with Stenhouse, Cope, Joyce, Ninnis, Morga and Aitken to search for a landing place. "We steered in towards the barrier," wrote Stenhouse, "and found an opening leading into a large bight which jutted back to eastward into the barrier. We endeavoured without success to scale the steep ice foot under the cliffs, and then proceeded up the bay. Pulling along the edge of perpendicular ice, we turned into a bay in the ice cliff and came to a cul-de-sac, at the head of which was a grotto. At the head of the grotto and on a ledge of snow were perched some Adelie penguins. The beautiful green and blue tints in the ice colouring made a picture as unreal as a stage setting. Coming back along the edge of the bight towards the land, we caught and killed one penguin, much to the surprise of another, which ducked into a niche in the ice, and after much squawking was extracted with a boat hook and captured. We returned to our original landing, and were fortunate in our time, for no sooner had we cleared the ledge where Ninnis had been hanging in his endeavour to catch the penguin than the barrier calved, and a piece weighing hundreds of tons toppled over into the sea. Since we left the ship, a mist had blown up from the south, and when we arrived back at the entrance to the bay, the ship could be but dimly seen. We found a slope on the ice foot, and Joyce and I managed, by cutting steps, to climb up to a ledge of debris between the cliffs and the ice, which we thought might lead to the vicinity of the emperor penguin rookery. I sent the boat back to the ship to tell the captain of our failure to find a spot where we could depot the hut and stores, and then, with Joyce, set out to walk along the narrow land between the cliffs and the ice to the southward, in hopes of finding the rookery. We walked for about a mile along the foot of the cliffs, over undulating paths, sometimes crawling carefully down a gully and then over rocks and debris which had fallen from the steep cliffs which towered above us, but we saw no sign of a rookery or any place where a rookery could be. Close to the cliffs and separated from them by the path on which we travelled, the barrier in its movement towards the sea had broken and showed signs of pressure. Seeing a turn in the cliffs ahead, which we thought might lead to better prospects, we trudged on and were rewarded by a sight which Joyce admitted as being the grandest he had ever witnessed. The barrier had come into contact with the cliffs, and, from where we viewed it, it looked as if icebergs had fallen into a tremendous cavern and laid jumbled together in wild disorder. Looking down into that wonderful picture, one realized a little the eternalness of things. We had not long to wait, and, much as we wished to go ahead, had to turn back. I went into a small crevasse. No damage. Arriving back at the place where we had left the boat, we found it had not returned, so sat down under an overhang and smoked and enjoyed the sense of loneliness. Soon the boat appeared out of the mist, and the crew had much news for us. After we left the ship, the captain manoeuvred her in order to get close to the barrier, but, unfortunately, the engines were loath to be reversed when required to go astern, and the ship hit the barrier end on. The barrier here is about 20 feet high, and her jib boom took the weight and snapped at the cap. When I returned, Thompson was busy getting the broken boom and gear aboard. Luckily the cap was not broken, and no damage was done aloft, but it was rather a bad introduction to the Antarctic. There is no place to land the Cape Crozier hut and stores, so we must build a hut in the winter here, which will mean so much extra sledging from winter quarters. Bad start, good finish. Joyce and I went aloft to the crow's nest, but could see no opening in the barrier to eastward, where a ship might enter and get farther south. Mackintosh proceeded into McMurdo Sound. Heavy pack delayed the ship for 3 days, and it was not until January 16th that she reached a point off Cape Evans, where he landed 10 tons of coal and 98 cases of oil. During succeeding days, Captain Mackintosh worked the Aurora southward, and by January 24th he was within 9 miles of Hut Point. There he made the ship fast to sea ice, then breaking up rapidly, and proceeded to arrange sledging parties. It was his intention to direct the laying of the depots himself, and to leave his first officer, Lieutenant J.R. Stenhouse, in command of the Aurora, with instructions to select a base and land a party. The first objective was Hut Point, where stands the hut erected by the Discovery Expedition in 1902. An advance party consisting of Joyce, in charge, Jack, and Gaze, with dogs and fully loaded sledges, left the ship on January 24th. Mackintosh, with Wild and Smith, followed the next day, and a supporting party, consisting of Cope, in charge, Stevens, Ninnis, Haywood, Hook, and Richards, left the ship on January 30th. The first 2 parties had dog teams. The third party took with it the motor tractor, which does not appear to have given the good service I had hoped to get from it. These parties had a strenuous time during the weeks that followed. The men, fresh from shipboard, were not in the best of training, and the same was true of the dogs. It was unfortunate that the dogs had to be worked so early after their arrival in the Antarctic. They were in poor condition, and they had not learned to work together as teams. The result was the loss of many of the dogs, and this proved a serious matter in the following season. Captain Mackintosh's record of the sledging in the early months of 1915 is fairly full. It will not be necessary here to follow the fortunes of the various parties in detail, for although the men were facing difficulties and dangers, they were on well-travelled ground, which has been made familiar to most readers by the histories of earlier expeditions. Captain Mackintosh and his party left the Aurora on the evening of January 25th. They had 9 dogs and 1 heavily loaded sledge, and started off briskly to the accompaniment of a cheer from their shipmates. The dogs were so eager for exercise after their prolonged confinement aboard the ship that they dashed forward at their best speed, and it was necessary for one man to sit upon the sledge in order to moderate the pace. Mackintosh had hoped to get to Hut Point that night, but luck was against him. The weather broke after he had travelled about 5 miles, and snow, which completely obscured all landmarks, sent him into camp on the sea ice. The weather was still thick on the following morning, and the party, making a start after breakfast, missed its way. "We shaped a course where I imagined Hut Point to be," wrote Captain Mackintosh in his diary, "but when the sledge meter showed 13 miles 50 yards, which is 4 miles in excess of the distance from the slip to Hut Point, I decided to halt again. The surface was changing considerably, and the land was still obscured. We have been travelling over a thick snow surface, in which we sink deeply, and the dogs are not too cheerful about it." They started again at noon on January 27th, when the weather had cleared sufficiently to reveal the land, and reached Hut Point at 4 p.m. The sledge meter showed that the total distance travelled had been over 17 miles. Mackintosh found in the hut a note from Joyce, who had been there on the 25th, and who reported that one of his dogs had been killed in a fight with its companions. The hut contained some stores left there by earlier expeditions. The party stayed there for the night. Mackintosh left a note for Stenhouse, directing him to place provisions in the hut, in case the sledging parties did not return in time to be taken off by the ship. Early next morning, Joyce reached the hut. He had encountered bad ice and had come back to consult with Mackintosh regarding the route to be followed. Mackintosh directed him to steer out towards Black Island in crossing the head of the sound beyond Hut Point. Mackintosh left Hut Point on January 28th. He had taken some additional stores, and he mentions that the sledge now weighed 1,200 pounds. This was a heavy load, but the dogs were pulling well, and he thought it practicable. He encountered difficulty almost at once after descending the slope from the point to the sea ice, for the sledge stuck in soft snow, and the party had to lighten the load and relay until they reached a better surface. They were having trouble with the dogs, which did not pull cheerfully, and the total distance covered in the day was under 4 miles. The weather was warm, and the snow consequently was soft. Mackintosh had decided that it would be best to travel at night. A fall of snow held up the party throughout the following day, and they did not get away from their camp until shortly before midnight. "The surface was abominably soft," wrote Mackintosh. "We harnessed ourselves onto the sledge and with the dogs made a start. But we had a struggle to get off. We had not gone very far when in deeper snow we stopped dead. Try as we would, no movement could be produced. Reluctantly we unloaded and began the tedious task of relaying. The work, in spite of the lighter load on the sledge, proved terrific for ourselves and for the dogs. We struggled for 4 hours and then set camp to await the evening when the sun would not be so fierce and the surface might be better. I must say I feel somewhat despondent, as we are not getting on as well as I expected, nor do we find it as easy as one would gather from reading." The two parties met again that day. Joyce also had been compelled to relay his load, and all hands laboured strenuously and advanced slowly. They reached the edge of the barrier on the night of January 30th, and climbed an easy slope to the barrier surface, about 30 feet above the sea ice. The dogs were showing signs of fatigue, and when Mackintosh camped at 6:30 a.m. on January 31st, he reckoned that the distance covered in 12.5 hours had been about 2.5 miles. The men had killed a seal at the edge of the sea ice, and placed the meat in a can for future use. One dog, having refused to pull, had been left behind with a good feed of meat, and Mackintosh hoped the animal would follow. The experiences of the party during the days that followed can be indicated by some extracts from Mackintosh's diary. Sunday, January 31st. Started off this afternoon at 3 p.m. Surface too dreadful for words. We sink into snow at times up to our knees, the dogs struggling out of it, panting and making great efforts. I think the soft snow must be accounted for by a phenomenally fine summer without much wind. After proceeding about 1,000 yards, I spotted some poles on our starboard side. We shaped course for these and found Captain Scott's safety camp. We unloaded a relay here and went back with empty sledge for the second relay. It took us 4 hours to do just this short distance. It is exasperating. After we had got the second load up, we had lunch. Then we dug round the poles, white snow fell, and after getting down about 3 feet, we came across, first, a bag of oats. Lower down, 2 cases of dog biscuit, one with a complete week's ration, the other with seal meat. A good find. About 40 paces away, we found a venesta lid sticking out of the snow. Smith scraped round this with his ice axe, and presently discovered one of the motor sledges Captain Scott used. Everything was just as it had been left, the petrol tank partly filled and apparently undeteriorated. We marked the spot with a pole. The snow clearing, we proceeded with a relay. We got only half a mile, still struggling in deep snow, and then went back for the second load. We can still see the cairn erected at the barrier edge and a black spot which we take to be the dog. February 1st. We turned out at 7:30 p.m. and after a meal broke camp. We made a relay of 2.5 miles. The sledge meter stopped during this relay. Perhaps that is the cause of our mileage not showing. We covered 7.5 miles in order to bring the load 2.5 miles. After lunch we decided, as the surface was getting better, to make a shot at travelling with a whole load. It was a back-breaking job. Wild led the team, while Smith and I pulled in harness. The great trouble is to get the sledge started after many unavoidable stops. We managed to cover 1 mile. This even is better than relaying. We then camped, the dogs being entirely done up, poor brutes. February 2nd. We were awakened this afternoon, while in our bags, by hearing Joyce's dogs barking. They have done well and have caught us up. Joyce's voice was heard presently, asking us the time. He is managing the full load. We issued a challenge to race him to the bluff, which he accepted. When we turned out at 6:30 p.m, his camp was seen about 3 miles ahead. About 8 p.m, after our hoosh, we made a start and reached Joyce's camp at 1 a.m. The dogs had been pulling well, seeing the camp ahead, but when we arrived off it, they were not inclined to go on. After a little persuasion and struggle we got off, but not for long. This starting business is terrible work. We have to shake the sledge and its big load while we shout to the dogs to start. If they do not pull together it is useless. When we get the sledge going, we are on tenterhooks lest it stop again on the next soft slope, and this often occurs. Sledging is real hard work, but we are getting along. End of chapter 13, part 1. Recorded by Gesine in September 2007. Of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 13, The Ross Sea Party, Part 2. The surface was better on February 2nd, and the party covered 6 miles without relaying. They camped in soft snow, and when they started the next day, they were 2 hours relaying over 150 yards. Then they got into Joyce's track and found the going better. Mackintosh overtook Joyce on the morning of February 4th and went ahead, his party breaking trail during the next march. They covered 10 miles on the night of the 4th. One dog had chucked his hand in on the march, and McIntosh mentions that he intended to increase the dog's allowance of food. The surface was harder, and during the night of February 5th, McIntosh covered 11 miles, 25 yards, but he finished with 2 dogs on the sledge. Joyce was travelling by day, so that the parties passed one another daily on the march. A blizzard came from the south on February 10th, and the parties were confined to their tents for over 24 hours. The weather moderated on the morning of the next day, and at 11 a.m. McIntosh camped beside Joyce and proceeded to rearrange the parties. One of his dogs had died on the 9th, and several others had ceased to be worth much for pulling. He had decided to take the best dogs from the 2 teams and continue the march with Joyce and Wild, while Smith, Jack and Gaze went back to Hut Point with the remaining dogs. This involved the adjustment of sledge loads in order that the proper supplies might be available for the depots. He had 8 dogs and Smith had 5. A depot of oil and fuel was laid at this point and marked by a cairn with a bamboo pole rising 10 feet above it. The change made for better progress. Smith turned back at once, and the other party went ahead fairly rapidly, the dogs being able to haul the sledge without much assistance from the men. The party built a cairn of snow after each hour's travelling to serve as guides to the depot and as marks for the return journey. Another blizzard held the men up on February 13th, and they had an uncomfortable time in their sleeping bags owing to low temperature. During succeeding days the party plodded forward. They were able to cover from 5 to 12 miles a day, according to the surface and weather. They built the cairns regularly and checked their route by taking bearings of the mountains to the west. They were able to cover from 5 to 12 miles a day, the dogs pulling fairly well. They reached latitude 80 degrees south on the afternoon on February 20th. McIntosh had hoped to find a depot laid in that neighbourhood by Captain Scott, but no trace of it was seen. The surface had been very rough during the afternoon, and for that reason the depot to be laid there was named Rocky Mountain Depot. The stores were to be placed on a substantial cairn, and smaller cairns were to be built at right angles to the depot as a guide to the overland party. As soon as breakfast was over, wrote McIntosh the next day, Joyce and Wild went off with a light sledge and the dogs to lay out the cairns and place flags to the eastward, building them at every mile. The outer cairn had a large flag and a note indicating the position of the depot. I remained behind to get angles and fix our position with the theodolite. The temperature was very low this morning, and handling the theodolite was not too warm a job for the fingers. My whiskers froze to the metal while I was taking a sight. After 5 hours the others arrived back. They had covered 10 miles, 5 miles out and 5 miles back. During the afternoon we finished the cairn, which we have built to a height of 8 feet. It is a solid square erection, which ought to stand a good deal of weathering, and on top we have placed a bamboo pole with a flag, marking the total height 25 feet. Building the cairn was a fine warming job, but the ice on our whiskers often took some 10 minutes thawing out. Tomorrow we hope to lay out the cairns to the westward, and then to shape our course for the bluff. The weather became bad again during the night. A blizzard kept the men in their sleeping bags on February 21st, and it was not until the afternoon of the 23rd that McIntosh and Joyce made an attempt to lay out the cairns to the west. They found that 2 of the dogs had died during the storm, leaving 7 dogs to haul the sledge. They marked 1.5 miles to the westward and built a cairn, but the weather was very thick, and they did not think it wise to proceed farther. They could not see more than 100 yards, and the tent was soon out of sight. They returned to the camp and stayed there until the morning of February 24th, when they started the return march with snow still falling. "We did get off from our camp," said Mackintosh, "but had only proceeded about 400 yards when the fog came on so thick that we could scarcely see a yard ahead. So we had to pitch the tent again, and are now sitting inside, hoping the weather will clear. We are going back with only 10 days' provisions, so it means pushing on for all we are worth. These stoppages are truly annoying. The poor dogs are feeling hungry, they eat their harness or any straps that may be about. We give them nothing beyond their allowance of 3 biscuits each, as we are on bare rations ourselves, but I feel sure they require more than £1 a day. That is